In the shadow of America's counterculture movement, as Vietnam protesters filled the streets and Apollo missions reached for the stars, a technological revolution was brewing in the quiet suburbs south of San Francisco. This unassuming stretch of California farmland would transform from orchards into the epicenter of human innovation, with such startling speed that engineers across the Pacific, particularly in China, could scarcely believe what they were witnessing. While Mao's Cultural Revolution had sent China's intellectual elite to rural labor camps, destroying technical progress for a generation, a handful of American college dropouts working from their parents' garages were about to change the world forever. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. It began with a perfect storm of historical forces. By the late 1960s, the Santa Clara Valley housed defense contractors and aerospace firms drawn to Stanford University's engineering talent. But it was the invention of the microprocessor, a computer on a chip, that would create the spark. This revolutionary technology didn't emerge from a government laboratory or established industry titan, but from a new company called Intel, founded by Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce after they left Fairchild Semiconductor in 1968. The year 1971 marked the debut of Intel's 4004 microprocessor, containing 2,300 transistors on a sliver of silicon smaller than a fingernail. To grasp the magnitude of this achievement, this tiny chip delivered the same computing power as the first electronic computer ENIAC, which had filled an entire room and weighed 30 tons just 25 years earlier. When news of this invention reached engineers in China and the Soviet Union, many dismissed the reports as American propaganda. The miniaturization seemed technically impossible. While American engineers raced forward with each innovation building upon the last, Chinese technologists remained isolated. China's computer industry in the early 1970s was decades behind, still working with vacuum tube technology that America had abandoned years before. The Cultural Revolution had devastated China's scientific community, with many top engineers subjected to struggle sessions where they were publicly humiliated for their bourgeois expertise. As one Chinese engineer who later visited Silicon Valley would remark, "We thought we were keeping pace with world developments. When I first saw what was happening in California, I realized we were living in the technological dark ages." This divergence wasn't merely technological, it represented fundamentally different philosophies. China's top-down, centrally planned approach to technology development stood in stark contrast to the entrepreneurial chaos taking root in Northern California. The Santa Clara Valley, soon to be rechristened Silicon Valley by journalist Don Hoefler in 1971, operated on principles that would have been heretical in Mao's China: individual initiative, risk-taking, job-hopping, and the free exchange of ideas. The story of this transformation is perhaps best embodied by a bearded college dropout named Steve Wozniak. In 1975, Wozniak was a brilliant but aimless engineer working at Hewlett-Packard when he began attending meetings of the Homebrew Computer Club, an informal gathering of electronics enthusiasts who met in a Menlo Park garage to share ideas about personal computing. The concept that regular people might own computers was radical. At the time, computers were million-dollar mainframes operated by men in white lab coats. At these meetings, Wozniak met another Steve, Jobs, who would push him to turn his hobby project into a product. Jobs, adopted at birth and a spiritual seeker who had recently returned from a pilgrimage to India, possessed neither Wozniak's engineering genius nor a college degree. What he had was vision, charisma, and relentless ambition. Together, they would found Apple Computer in 1976, working from the Jobs family garage in Los Altos. Their first product, the Apple II, was little more than a circuit board that hobbyists could use to build their own computers. But their follow-up, 1977's Apple II, would change everything. It was the world's first fully assembled, consumer-friendly personal computer. While IBM and the established computer industry dismissed these garage startups as toys, Apple sold 6 million Apple II computers, creating a billion-dollar company practically overnight. A Chinese delegation of computer scientists that visited the United States in 1978 was shocked by what they found. They had expected to tour massive government facilities. Instead, they were taken to small industrial parks where young men in jeans and T-shirts were building the future. As one delegate later wrote in a classified report to Beijing, these Americans have somehow turned computer manufacturing from a strategic national industry into a commercial enterprise run by inexperienced young people. Yet they are succeeding where our 5-year plans have failed. The Apple II's success catalyzed a gold rush. Suddenly, venture capitalists were pouring millions into startups with little more than a prototype and a business plan. Companies like Atari, Commodore, and dozens of now-forgotten computer makers sprouted across the valley. Many failed, but those that succeeded did so spectacularly. Between 1977 and 1983, Silicon Valley created more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in history. While the hardware revolution accelerated, another transformative development was brewing. In 1975, a Harvard dropout named Bill Gates and his childhood friend Paul Allen founded Microsoft after seeing the MIT's Altair 8800 featured on the cover of Popular Electronics magazine. Unlike the hardware-focused entrepreneurs of Silicon Valley, Gates understood that software would ultimately become the most valuable component of computing. As he would later write in an internal memo, hardware will be given away just to sell the software that runs on it. Gates moved Microsoft to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to be near MITS, the maker of the Altair. There, he and Allen created a version of the basic programming language for personal computers. This move established a pattern that would define the personal computer revolution: intense collaboration punctuated by fierce competition and occasional betrayal. The most significant example came in 1980 when IBM, the dominant force in business computing, decided to enter the personal computer market. Rather than build everything in-house as they had always done, IBM took the unprecedented step of outsourcing components to small companies, including a processor from Intel and an operating system from Microsoft. This decision not only legitimized the personal computer as a business tool, but also set the stage for Intel and Microsoft to eventually eclipse IBM in power and market value. Gates seized this opportunity by purchasing a rudimentary operating system called QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System, from Seattle Computer Products for $50,000, modifying it slightly and licensing it to IBM as MS-DOS. Crucially, Gates retained the right to sell the same operating system to IBM's competitors, creating the standardized PC market that would dominate computing for decades. This rapid transformation of computing from government and big business monopoly to consumer product had profound implications. In China, officials who had once dismissed Silicon Valley's achievements were now growing alarmed. A 1982 Chinese intelligence assessment warned, "The Americans have changed the nature of both technological and economic warfare. Their garage companies are outperforming our institutes staffed with thousands of engineers." The cultural elements that enabled Silicon Valley's explosion were precisely what China lacked under communism. The Valley thrived on a uniquely American combination of factors: prestigious universities feeding talent into the private sector, a risk-tolerant investment culture, a legal system that protected intellectual property while allowing employees to change jobs freely, and a social environment that didn't stigmatize failure. As venture capitalist Arthur Rock famously said, "In Silicon Valley, bankruptcy is just another word for experience." The speed of innovation accelerated further with the introduction of the first IBM PC in August 1981. Unlike Apple's proprietary design, IBM's open architecture allowed other manufacturers to create compatible machines, sparking fierce competition that drove prices down and capabilities up. The IBM PC-compatible market exploded, with companies like Compaq pioneering legal reverse engineering to create clones that ran the same software. Chinese officials sent increasingly urgent delegations to study this phenomenon. One 1983 report to the Chinese Academy of Sciences concluded, "Their secret is not superior intelligence or resources, but a system that turns individual creativity into industrial products at unprecedented speed." This observation would eventually influence Deng Xiaoping's market reforms, though China would take decades to develop its own innovation ecosystem. Meanwhile, the semiconductor industry that gave Silicon Valley its name was advancing at a pace that defied belief. In 1965, Gordon Moore had observed that the number of transistors on an integrated circuit doubled approximately every 2 years. This observation, later known as Moore's Law, proved remarkably prescient. The Intel 8088 processor that powered the first IBM PC contained 29,000 transistors. Just 5 years later, Intel's 80386 would pack 275,000 transistors, offering roughly 10 times the performance. This exponential growth seemed to violate the laws of physics, leaving engineers in more centrally planned economies mystified. A Soviet semiconductor researcher who defected to the West in 1985 explained, "We thought American technical journals were publishing science fiction. We couldn't believe anyone could manufacture at these densities without astronomically high defect rates." The secret wasn't just technical, it was organizational. Companies like Intel operated with a flat management structure and encouraged engineers to challenge authority. Robert Noyce, Intel's co-founder, insisted on open-plan offices and minimal status distinctions. As he explained to a visiting Chinese delegation, "In our company, the best idea wins, not the highest-ranking person's idea." This cultural divide was exemplified by a story from the mid-1980s. When Chinese computer scientists were finally allowed to establish their own research institutes after the Cultural Revolution, they meticulously studied and attempted to copy Silicon Valley's technical achievements. But as one Chinese engineer later admitted, "We could duplicate the circuits, but not the system that created them. We had the same human talent, but our engineers needed permission from multiple bureaucrats to make changes to a design." By 1984, the personal computer revolution had reached a crucial inflection point. IBM PCs and their clones dominated the business market with their text-based interfaces, while Apple was struggling to recapture its early success. Jobs, believing that the future lay in computers that were both powerful and accessible to non-technical users, had been working on a secret project that would reinvent the industry again. In January 1984, during the third quarter of Super Bowl XLVIII, Apple aired a television commercial directed by Ridley Scott that introduced the Macintosh computer. The now famous 1984 ad depicted a female athlete hurling a sledgehammer at a screen showing a Big Brother-like figure, a thinly veiled representation of IBM. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Personal computing would free humanity from corporate and government control. The Macintosh itself was revolutionary. Unlike the command line interfaces of existing computers, the Mac featured a graphical user interface with icons, windows, and a mouse, technologies pioneered at Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, but never successfully commercialized. When Chinese computer scientists saw the Macintosh, one reportedly said, "Now I understand why we are behind. We have been copying the wrong things." Jobs understood something that many engineers missed. Computing wasn't just about processing power. It was about the human experience. The Macintosh made computers accessible to artists, writers, and everyday people. As Jobs said at the launch, "We made the buttons on the screen look so good, you'll want to lick them." However, Jobs' perfectionism and difficult management style led to conflicts within Apple. The Macintosh, while innovative, was expensive and initially had limited software. Sales, after an initial surge, disappointed. By 1985, Apple's board sided with CEO John Sculley, whom Jobs had recruited from Pepsi with the famous challenge, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to change the world?" in a power struggle that resulted in Jobs being removed from operational duties. Jobs' departure from Apple marked the end of Silicon Valley's foundational period. By 1985, the industry had grown from garage startups to global corporations worth billions. The pioneers, Noyce, Moore, Wozniak, Jobs, Gates, had become wealthy beyond imagination and, in some cases, household names. The transformation of the Santa Clara Valley from orchards to office parks was complete. For Chinese observers, Silicon Valley's rise represented both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge was clear. America had established an insurmountable lead in the technologies that would define the future. The opportunity was in learning from Silicon Valley's methods. As one Chinese report concluded, their system works because it harnesses human creativity rather than trying to control it. This is the most important lesson we must learn. The mid-1980s marked another turning point as computing began to spread beyond business applications. Desktop publishing, combining Macintosh computers, Adobe's PostScript language, and Apple's LaserWriter printer, revolutionized the printing industry. Suddenly, anyone could produce professional-looking documents without specialized training. This democratization of technology became a hallmark of the personal computer revolution. The impact extended far beyond American shores. In the Soviet Union, authorities restricted access to copying machines, fearing samizdat, self-published dissident literature. The prospect of personal computers with printers terrified regimes built on controlling information. In China, as the country gradually opened under Deng Xiaoping's reforms, officials debated how to gain the benefits of information technology without undermining party control, a tension that continues to this day. Silicon Valley's technological achievements were stunning, but equally important was the culture that produced them. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of East Coast corporations or government research labs, the Valley operated on what became known as West Coast rules: casual dress, flexible hours, stock options instead of pensions, and the understanding that employees might leave to become competitors. This dynamic environment attracted talent from around the world, including increasingly from Asia. By the mid-1980s, nearly one-third of Silicon Valley's engineers were immigrants, with a growing contingent from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland China. These engineers became crucial bridges, transferring not just technology, but cultural practices back to their home countries. Many would eventually return to Asia to start their own companies, seeding what would become formidable technology hubs in Hsinchu, Shenzhen, and Bangalore. The true believers in Silicon Valley's potential were the venture capitalists who funded its growth. Firms like Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia Capital pioneered a high-risk, high-reward investment model that seemed reckless to traditional financiers, but perfectly matched the explosive potential of computing startups. Don Valentine of Sequoia described his investment philosophy: "I'm looking for markets that can be enormous and entrepreneurs crazy enough to try to dominate them." This venture model was entirely alien to Chinese officials who first encountered it. In China's state-planned economy, funding came through bureaucratic channels based on 5-year plans and political considerations. The concept that small groups of private investors could bet millions on unproven technologies developed by 20-somethings seemed like economic madness. Yet the results were undeniable. As the 1980s progressed, semiconductor manufacturing became increasingly sophisticated. Fabrication plants, fabs, costing hundreds of millions of dollars, replaced the relatively simple facilities of the previous decade. This raised the stakes dramatically. A single mistake in the manufacturing process could ruin months of work. The capital intensity drove consolidation, with fewer companies able to afford cutting-edge facilities. The challenges were particularly acute for memory chips, where Japanese companies like NEC and Toshiba gained a competitive edge through quality manufacturing and government support. By the mid-1980s, American companies were abandoning the memory market to focus on more complex, higher-margin chips like microprocessors. This transition alarmed U.S. defense officials who worried about dependence on foreign suppliers for critical components. The growing perception that Japan was winning the semiconductor race prompted unprecedented cooperation among American competitors. In 1987, 14 U.S. companies formed Sematech, Semiconductor Manufacturing Technology, a consortium supported by the Department of Defense to regain manufacturing expertise. This marked a rare deviation from Silicon Valley's free market ethos, reflecting the strategic importance of semiconductor technology. For Chinese observers, America's willingness to intervene in the market confirmed their belief that behind the rhetoric of free enterprise lay strategic industrial policy. As one Chinese report noted, when the Americans felt threatened by Japan, they quickly abandoned pure capitalism. This proves that no nation can afford to leave critical technologies entirely to market forces. By the late 1980s, personal computers had become essential business tools, with global annual sales exceeding 20 million units. Microsoft's operating systems powered the vast majority, fulfilling Bill Gates's ambition to put a computer on every desk and in every home, all running Microsoft software. The standardization around Microsoft's DOS and later Windows created a massive market for software developers and drove further adoption. This standardization had complex implications. It created efficiency through compatibility, but also established monopolistic market dynamics that would later attract antitrust scrutiny. For users, the benefits were immediate. Software became more affordable as development costs could be amortized across millions of identical systems. Meanwhile, networking technologies were laying the groundwork for the next revolution. In 1983, ARPANET had switched to the TCP/IP protocol, effectively becoming the Internet. By the late 1980s, email was spreading beyond research institutions to businesses. Companies like Cisco Systems, founded in 1984 by Stanford computer scientists, were building the routers and switches that would form the Internet's infrastructure. Few recognized the Internet's transformative potential at the time. It remained primarily a tool for academics and government researchers, with commercial activity prohibited until 1992. One notable exception was Apple's John Sculley, who in 1987 described a future knowledge navigator that would connect users to a global information network, a remarkably prescient vision of today's Internet-connected devices. The same year, a Stanford graduate student named Larry Tesler traveled to China as part of an Apple delegation. He was stunned by what he found. Their best computer center had machines that would have been considered obsolete in America 5 years earlier. But their programmers were doing incredible things with limited resources, solving problems through ingenuity rather than raw computing power. This observation highlights a crucial point. While America's technological lead was enormous, human talent was more evenly distributed. China's disadvantage wasn't intellectual capacity, but systemic constraints. As Deng Xiaoping's reforms progressed, these constraints began to loosen, setting the stage for China's own technological rise decades later. By 1989, Silicon Valley had transformed computing from an institutional resource to a personal tool, creating unimaginable wealth in the process. The Forbes 400 list of richest Americans now featured dozens of technology entrepreneurs, most under 40 years old. This new wealth created tensions with the Valley's countercultural roots, as former hippies became millionaires and sometimes billionaires. The late 1980s also saw early signs of trouble. On Black Monday in October 1987, stock markets worldwide crashed, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average falling 22% in a single day. While the broader market recovered relatively quickly, the episode cast doubt on the sustainability of technology valuations. Then in 1989, a price-fixing scandal involving memory chips reinforced skepticism about the industry's business practices. More worryingly for American leaders, U.S. dominance in critical technologies seemed to be eroding. Japanese companies had overtaken American firms in semiconductor manufacturing and consumer electronics. Books like Trading Places, How We Are Giving Our Future to Japan, and How to Reclaim It became bestsellers, reflecting anxiety about America's technological future. But beneath these concerns, Silicon Valley was preparing for its next transformation. Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN in Switzerland, was developing the World Wide Web. Adobe and Apple were pioneering digital media technologies. And in suburban Seattle, Microsoft was working on Windows 3.0, which would finally deliver on the promise of graphical computing for the masses. For Chinese leaders watching from across the Pacific, Silicon Valley's trajectory offered crucial lessons. They had initially dismissed America's garage startups as curiosities, then marveled at their success, and finally recognized that the ecosystem, universities, venture capital, intellectual property protection, and entrepreneurial culture, was as important as the technology itself. The question facing China became whether aspects of this innovation model could be transplanted into a system with fundamentally different political values. Could China harness the creative power of free enterprise while maintaining party control? The answer would shape global technology competition for decades to come. As the 1980s drew to a close, Steve Jobs, now running a struggling computer company called Next after his ouster from Apple, gave an interview in which he reflected on Silicon Valley's achievements. I think one of the things that really separates us from the high primates is that we're tool builders. I read a study that measured the efficiency of locomotion for various species on the planet. Humans came in with a rather unimpressive showing about a third of the way down the list. But then somebody at Scientific American had the insight to test the efficiency of locomotion for a man on a bicycle, and man on a bicycle blew away the condor all the way to the top of the list. And that's what a computer is to me. The most remarkable tool that we've ever come up with. This philosophy that technology should amplify human capability rather than replace it defined Silicon Valley's first great era. Computers had transformed from room-sized calculating machines operated by specialists to personal tools accessible to anyone. In the process, they had created a new economic and cultural force centered in a formerly agricultural valley south of San Francisco. The story of how this happened, how a handful of visionaries, working with little initial support from government or established industry, created technologies that would fundamentally reshape human society, represents one of history's most remarkable bursts of innovation. And as we'll see in the continuation of our exploration, this was just the beginning. As the 1990s dawned, few could have predicted how profoundly the innovations brewing in Silicon Valley would transform global civilization. While Chinese engineers and officials had watched America's microcomputer revolution with a mixture of disbelief and strategic concern throughout the 1980s, what came next would force a complete reevaluation of China's technological future. The Internet was about to change everything, and Silicon Valley stood at the epicenter of this second, even more disruptive revolution. The decade began inauspiciously for American technology companies. A recession in 1990-91 hit computer manufacturers particularly hard, with even mighty IBM recording what was then the largest corporate loss in American history, $497 billion in 1992. The company that had once symbolized American technological supremacy announced plans to lay off 25,000 employees, sending shockwaves through the industry. Chinese technology planners who had been scrambling to catch up with American hardware capabilities viewed this moment as a potential inflection point. The American technology giants are faltering, wrote one analyst for China's Ministry of Electronics Industry in 1992. This may provide us with an opportunity to narrow the gap. But this analysis misunderstood what was happening. IBM's struggles weren't a sign of American technological decline, but rather evidence of a fundamental industry shift from hardware-focused mainframes to networked personal computing. Microsoft recognized this shift earlier than most. Windows 3.0, released in 1990, finally delivered a usable graphical interface for IBM-compatible PCs. Windows 3.1, which followed in 1992, sold more than 3 million copies in its first 2 months, numbers that astonished Chinese officials accustomed to centrally planned technology rollouts. By the mid-1990s, Microsoft's Windows and Office dominated the software landscape, generating profit margins that manufacturing-focused companies could only dream of. Software is a fundamentally different business than hardware, explained Microsoft executive Steve Ballmer during a 1993 presentation that was closely studied by Chinese technology companies. Once you've developed the code, you can reproduce it infinitely at almost no cost. The economics are entirely different from manufacturing. This model, high initial investment followed by near-zero marginal costs, would become central to Silicon Valley's next phase. Meanwhile, a technology that had been developing quietly in government and academic circles was about to burst into public consciousness. In 1991, the U.S. National Science Foundation lifted restrictions on commercial use of the Internet, opening the floodgates for business applications. The following year, the World Wide Web, developed by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN, began to spread beyond scientific institutions. The early web was primitive by today's standards, text-based, slow, and difficult to navigate. This changed dramatically in 1993 with the release of Mosaic, the first graphical web browser, developed by Marc Andreessen and colleagues at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. Suddenly, the Internet was visual, intuitive, and accessible to non-technical users. Andreessen, recognizing the commercial potential, moved to Silicon Valley and co-founded Netscape Communications. The company's Navigator browser, released in 1994, quickly dominated the market. Netscape's IPO in August 1995 marked a watershed moment for Silicon Valley and the global technology industry. Despite having minimal revenue and no profit, Netscape's stock price more than doubled on its first day of trading, valuing the company at nearly $3 billion. For Chinese observers, Netscape's IPO defied conventional economic logic. How can a company with almost no physical assets and little revenue be worth billions? Asked one report prepared for China's State Council. This challenges our entire understanding of industrial value. This puzzlement reflected a fundamental difference in perspective. Chinese economic thinking remained focused on tangible assets and manufacturing, while Silicon Valley was increasingly dealing in intellectual property and network effects. The Netscape IPO signaled the beginning of what would become known as the dot-com boom. Venture capital, which had fueled Silicon Valley's first wave of innovation, now flooded into Internet startups. Annual venture investment in the Valley grew from approximately $1 billion in 1995 to more than $10 billion by 1999. Companies with little more than a business concept and .com in their name could attract millions in funding. Microsoft, initially slow to recognize the Internet's importance, made a dramatic course correction. In May 1995, Bill Gates issued his famous Internet tidal wave memo, directing the company to make the Internet its central priority. Within months, Microsoft released Internet Explorer and began bundling it with Windows, challenging Netscape's dominance in a strategy that would later trigger antitrust investigations. The rapid commercialization of the Internet stunned Chinese technology planners who had been focused on hardware manufacturing and basic software development. China had only connected to the global Internet in 1994, and Chinese authorities viewed it primarily as a research network, not a commercial platform. By the time they recognized its economic potential, American companies had established commanding leads in every significant Internet category. A delegation of Chinese computer scientists visited Silicon Valley in 1996 and returned with alarming assessments. As one member reported, the Americans have created an entirely new model of technological development. Their internet companies grow from nothing to global scale in months, not years. They release imperfect products quickly and improve them through constant iteration. This is fundamentally different from our careful, centralized planning approach. This observation touched on a crucial aspect of Silicon Valley's culture that Chinese officials found both fascinating and disturbing: the embrace of failure as a learning mechanism. The Valley's mantra of fail fast, fail often directly contradicted China's emphasis on careful planning and risk avoidance. In a society where failure carried significant personal and professional stigma, the idea that multiple failures could precede breakthrough success seemed alien, yet the evidence was undeniable. By the mid-1990s, Silicon Valley was producing billionaires at an unprecedented rate, many of whom had previous failed ventures. The most dramatic example was Steve Jobs, who returned to Apple in 1997 after more than a decade in the wilderness. Apple, once Silicon Valley's brightest star, was now struggling to survive, having lost market share and direction under a series of ineffective leaders. Jobs' return to Apple represented more than a personal redemption story. It symbolized Silicon Valley's capacity for reinvention. He ruthlessly streamlined the company's bloated product line, forged a surprising partnership with former arch-rival Microsoft, and refocused Apple on design excellence. The 1998 introduction of the iMac, a colorful, user-friendly computer that emphasized internet connectivity, signaled Apple's revival and set the stage for its eventual transformation into the world's most valuable company. Chinese technology companies studied Apple's resurrection carefully. Lenovo, then known as Legend, which would later purchase IBM's personal computer division, modeled aspects of its design approach on Apple's emphasis on simplicity and user experience. As Lenovo founder Liu Chuanji later admitted, "We learned that technology alone is not enough." The American companies understood that emotional connection to products matters as much as specifications. While established technology companies were adapting to the Internet age, a new generation of startups was defining it. Yahoo, founded by Stanford graduates Jerry Yang and David Filo in 1994, began as a simple directory of websites, but quickly evolved into one of the Internet's most important navigation tools. By 1997, Yahoo was among the world's most visited websites, with a market capitalization exceeding $5 billion. Amazon, founded by Jeff Bezos in 1994, demonstrated that e-commerce could work even for physical products like books. Bezos, who had left a lucrative Wall Street career to start Amazon in his garage, epitomized Silicon Valley's risk-taking culture. His initial business plan acknowledged that the company would lose money for years, a strategy that bewildered conventional business analysts but ultimately proved prescient. These Internet pioneers established patterns that would define digital business, prioritizing growth over profit, using stock options to attract talent, and recognizing that in networked markets, becoming the standard was often more important than immediate revenue. As Bezos famously told shareholders, "It's all about the long term." For Chinese observers, this long-term thinking seemed paradoxically American. While Chinese economic planning operated on 5-year cycles, Silicon Valley venture capitalists and entrepreneurs thought in decades, accepting years of losses to build market-defining companies. This apparent contradiction, America's reputation for quarterly capitalism versus the Valley's willingness to defer profitability indefinitely, fascinated Chinese analysts. A 1997 report prepared for China's Ministry of Information Industry concluded, Silicon Valley's strength comes from its unique ecosystem. It's not just technology, it's the integration of universities, venture capital, legal structures, and cultural attitudes. We cannot simply copy individual companies or products. We must understand the system that produces them. This insight would eventually inform China's approach to technology development, as it shifted from copying specific technologies to building its own innovation ecosystems in cities like Shenzhen, Beijing, and Hangzhou. But in the late 1990s, the gap between Silicon Valley and China's nascent tech hubs seemed insurmountable. The contrast was particularly stark in semiconductor manufacturing, the technology that gave Silicon Valley its name. While American companies like Intel continued to fulfill Moore's Law, doubling transistor density approximately every 2 years, China's domestic chip-making capabilities remained decades behind. The 1997 return of Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty highlighted this disparity. Hong Kong's economy had already shifted towards services, while mainland China was still striving to master basic manufacturing. Yet beneath the surface, important connections were forming. Chinese students who had come to America for education were staying to work in Silicon Valley, forming a bridge between the two technological cultures. Organizations like the Silicon Valley Chinese Engineers Association, founded in 1989, facilitated knowledge transfer and professional networking. By the late 1990s, Chinese engineers constituted one of the largest ethnic groups in Silicon Valley's technical workforce. These engineers often maintained strong ties to China, becoming important conduits for both technical knowledge and cultural practices. As one Chinese-American venture capitalist observed in 1999, we're creating a trans-Pacific innovation network. Ideas and people flow in both directions, though the technology still flows primarily from west to east. The late 1990s also saw Silicon Valley's influence extend beyond technology into culture and lifestyle. Wired magazine, founded in 1993, promoted a techno-utopian vision that transcended computing to encompass art, politics, and philosophy. The casual dress, flexible hours, and free food that characterized Valley workplaces began to influence corporate culture worldwide, including in China's emerging tech firms. Companies like Google, founded by Stanford graduate students Larry Page and Sergey Brin in 1998, took this cultural approach to new extremes. Google's offices featured volleyball courts, massage rooms, and gourmet cafeterias, perks that seemed extravagant but helped attract top talent in an increasingly competitive market. When Chinese technology executives visited Google's headquarters, many were shocked by what seemed like wasteful indulgence, but was actually a strategic investment in human capital. As the millennium approached, Silicon Valley's second boom reached fever pitch. The Nasdaq Composite Index, heavily weighted toward technology stocks, rose from around 1,000 in 1995 to over 5,000 by March 2000. Internet companies with minimal revenue commanded billion-dollar valuations. Venture capitalists funded increasingly speculative business models, and initial public offerings routinely saw first-day price increases exceeding 100%. Chinese officials watching this frenzy were both envious and concerned. The wealth creation was undeniable. Silicon Valley had produced more millionaires in 5 years than China had in its entire reform period. But the speculative nature of the boom raised red flags for analysts trained in Marxist economic theory who warned that the irrational exuberance reflected capitalism's inherent instability. These concerns proved prescient. In April 2000, the Nasdaq began a precipitous decline, falling more than 75% over the next 2 years. Hundreds of internet companies failed, and venture capital investment plummeted. The dot-com crash seemed to validate skeptics who had dismissed the internet economy as a speculative bubble. But even as many internet companies disappeared, the technological infrastructure they had helped build remained. Internet adoption continued to grow globally, including in China, where the number of users increased from fewer than 1 million in 1997 to more than 22 million by 2000. This growing user base would eventually support China's own internet giants, though few recognized this potential amid the wreckage of the dot-com crash. The most successful American internet companies survived by adapting. Amazon narrowed its losses and expanded beyond books. eBay established dominance in online auctions, and Google refined its search technology while developing a revolutionary advertising model based on keywords rather than display ads. This period of creative destruction embodied Silicon Valley's approach to innovation, rapid experimentation, acceptance of failure, and continuous reinvention. As venture capitalist Vinod Khosla observed in 2001, the dot-com crash didn't invalidate the Internet. It just cleared out the companies that didn't have sustainable business models. For Chinese technology planners, the crash offered important lessons. It demonstrated that even in America's entrepreneurial system, economic fundamentals eventually reasserted themselves. But it also showed that disruption created opportunities. While established American technology companies struggled to adapt, new entrants were laying the groundwork for what would become known as Web 2.0, a more interactive, social Internet. In China, the dot-com crash coincided with a critical period of internal development. Zhongguancun, Beijing's technology district, often called China's Silicon Valley, was gaining momentum. Alibaba, founded by English teacher Jack Ma in 1999, had secured significant funding from Yahoo and SoftBank despite the global downturn. And Huawei, founded in 1987, was emerging as a serious telecommunications equipment competitor, beginning to challenge Western giants like Cisco and Nortel. The early 2000s marked a turning point in the technological relationship between America and China. While Silicon Valley remained the world's primary innovation hub, China was no longer merely copying, it was adapting and, in some cases, leapfrogging. As one Chinese venture capitalist who had worked in both countries observed in 2003, in Silicon Valley, they're enhancing existing digital lifestyles. In China, we're bringing millions of people online for the first time every month. The scale and pace of change is unprecedented. This divergence was most evident in mobile technology. While Americans gradually upgraded from desktop computers to laptops, many Chinese consumers skipped personal computers entirely and accessed the Internet first through mobile phones. This mobile-first development path would profoundly influence China's Internet ecosystem, making it more commerce-oriented and socially integrated than its American counterpart. Silicon Valley, meanwhile, was recovering from the dot-com crash and entering a new phase of innovation. Apple, continuing its remarkable resurrection under Jobs, released the iPod in 2001. This sleek music player revealed Jobs' evolving vision. Apple would no longer be just a computer company, but a consumer electronics leader focused on the digital lifestyle. The iPod exemplified Silicon Valley's emerging strength in integrating hardware, software, and services. While the device itself was impressive, its true power came from its seamless connection to iTunes, Apple's music management software, and online store. This integrated approach contrasted sharply with the more fragmented consumer electronics market dominated by Japanese and Korean manufacturers. Chinese technology companies studied this integration closely. As one Lenovo executive remarked after examining the iPod ecosystem, "We've been thinking about devices in isolation. The Americans are building digital platforms that combine hardware, software, and services. This is a completely different approach to product development." Google's growth during this period revealed another dimension of Silicon Valley's advantage. Founded on the strength of its search algorithm, Google rapidly diversified into email, Gmail, mapping, Google Maps, video, through the 2006 acquisition of YouTube, and mobile operating systems, Android. This expansion wasn't random, but reflected a strategic vision of an interconnected digital ecosystem powered by advertising revenue. This vision culminated in Google's 2004 IPO, which valued the company at $23 billion despite its relative youth. Google's public offering featured another Silicon Valley innovation, a Dutch auction that allowed smaller investors to participate and reduced the role of investment banks. The company's "Don't Be Evil" motto and founder's letter declaring that Google is not a conventional company reinforced Silicon Valley's self-image as a place where business was done differently. A Chinese delegation that visited Google's headquarters in 2005 was particularly struck by the company's corporate culture. As one visitor reported, their engineers spend 20% of their time on personal projects unrelated to their main responsibilities. This would be considered extremely wasteful in a Chinese company, yet it has produced some of Google's most successful products. This 20% time policy exemplified Silicon Valley's belief that innovation couldn't be rigidly scheduled or controlled, a concept that challenged China's more structured approach to research and development. Facebook, founded in a Harvard dormitory in 2004 and relocated to Silicon Valley the following year, represented another American innovation that would profoundly influence global internet development. The social network's explosive growth, from a single university to hundreds of millions of users worldwide in just a few years, demonstrated the power of network effects in the digital age. When Facebook surpassed China's social network Renren in users and valuation, despite having fewer employees, Chinese internet executives took notice. As one Tencent manager observed after visiting Facebook's offices in 2009, they achieve extraordinary scale with relatively small teams by leveraging user-generated content and algorithmic distribution. This is a fundamental shift from traditional media models that require large content creation staffs. Perhaps the most consequential Silicon Valley development of this period was largely invisible to consumers: cloud computing. Amazon Web Services, AWS, launched in 2006, allowed startups to access enterprise-grade computing infrastructure without significant capital investment. This dramatically lowered barriers to entry for new internet companies, accelerating innovation. The cloud model particularly interested Chinese technology planners who recognized its potential for both economic development and surveillance. A 2007 report to China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology noted, "American cloud infrastructure gives their startups unprecedented agility. We must develop equivalent capabilities, both to support our entrepreneurs and to ensure data sovereignty." Silicon Valley's mobile revolution began in earnest with Apple's introduction of the iPhone in 2007. Jobs presented it as a revolutionary product that changes everything, combining a phone, internet device, and music player in a single touchscreen-controlled package. The device's impact exceeded even these ambitious claims, creating a new computing paradigm and unleashing another wave of entrepreneurial activity. Chinese factories played a crucial role in making the iPhone possible. Foxconn's massive facilities in Shenzhen assembled Apple's devices with a scale and flexibility that would have been impossible in the United States. This arrangement reflected a new international division of labor. American companies designed products and created software, while Chinese manufacturers built the physical devices with increasing sophistication. However, this relationship was evolving. By the late 2000s, Chinese companies were no longer content to serve merely as manufacturing subcontractors. Firms like Huawei and ZTE were developing their own smartphones initially for the domestic market, but increasingly for global export. And Chinese internet companies were creating mobile applications tailored to local preferences and requirements. The 2008 global financial crisis accelerated these trends. While Western economies contracted, China continued growing, narrowing the economic gap. Silicon Valley companies recovered quickly from the initial shock, but the crisis reinforced Chinese confidence in their state-guided development model, which had weathered the downturn better than Western laissez-faire capitalism. A pivotal moment came in 2009 when China blocked several American internet services, including Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. This great firewall created protected space for Chinese alternatives: WeChat instead of Facebook, Weibo instead of Twitter, Youku instead of YouTube. While criticized internationally as digital protectionism, these policies enabled Chinese internet companies to develop without being immediately overwhelmed by established American platforms. By 2010, Silicon Valley and China's technology hubs were evolving along increasingly divergent paths. Valley companies like Apple, Google, and Facebook dominated global markets with a focus on user experience and advertising-supported services. Chinese firms like Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu were building more commerce-centric platforms optimized for mobile devices and designed to work within China's regulatory framework. This divergence was reinforced by the different venture capital ecosystems. Silicon Valley's venture firms remained primarily private entities seeking financial returns, while Chinese venture capital increasingly included government-linked funds with strategic as well as financial objectives. As one Chinese venture capitalist who had worked in both systems explained in 2011, in the Valley, VCs want unicorns, billion-dollar companies. In China, the government wants national champions that can advance both economic and political goals. The 2010s saw both Silicon Valley and China's tech sector reach new heights of economic influence and cultural significance. Apple became the world's most valuable public company in 2011, a position it has largely maintained since. Facebook surpassed 1 billion users in 2012, creating the largest social platform in human history. And Google's Android became the world's dominant mobile operating system, powering billions of devices globally. Meanwhile, China's technology giants achieved comparable scale within their domestic market. Alibaba's 2014 IPO on the New York Stock Exchange raised $25 billion, setting a record for the largest public offering in history. Tencent's WeChat evolved from a simple messaging app into an all-encompassing platform for communication, payments, and services used by virtually every smartphone owner in China. And companies like Xiaomi demonstrated that Chinese firms could now design and brand premium consumer electronics, not just manufacture them. This period also saw increased technological cross-fertilization. Chinese engineers who had worked in Silicon Valley returned home to start companies, bringing American management practices and technical knowledge. American technology executives made regular pilgrimages to Shenzhen and Beijing to study Chinese innovations in mobile payments, e-commerce, and hardware manufacturing. The relationship was becoming more balanced, though Silicon Valley maintained leadership in key areas like semiconductor design, operating systems, and enterprise software. As Apple CEO Tim Cook observed during a 2017 visit to China, the manufacturing ecosystem here is unrivaled. The scale, flexibility, and engineering talent is extraordinary, but the innovation is increasingly flowing in both directions. This technological convergence was complicated by growing geopolitical tensions. The Obama administration's pivot to Asia and the Trump administration's trade policies reflected mounting concerns about China's technological rise. Chinese initiatives like Made in China 2025 explicitly aimed to reduce dependence on Western technology while developing domestic capabilities in strategic sectors. Semiconductor technology remained a particular point of contention. Despite massive investment, China's chip manufacturing capabilities still lagged several generations behind industry leaders like Intel, Samsung, and Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. This dependency represented a strategic vulnerability for China's technology ambitions, as demonstrated by U.S. export restrictions on advanced semiconductor equipment imposed in the late 2010s. By 2020, the technological relationship between Silicon Valley and China had become enormously complex. Economic interdependence remained strong, with companies in both regions relying on each other for components, manufacturing, and markets. Yet, strategic competition was intensifying, particularly in emerging fields like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotechnology. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated digital transformation globally while exacerbating U.S.-China tensions. Remote work tools developed in Silicon Valley enabled business continuity during lockdowns. Chinese e-commerce platforms demonstrated remarkable resilience in maintaining supply chains, and both regions raced to develop digital health solutions, from contact tracing apps to vaccine research. Looking back over the 5 decades since Intel's 4004 microprocessor shocked Chinese engineers, the technological landscape had been transformed beyond recognition. Silicon Valley had evolved from a cluster of semiconductor manufacturers to the global epicenter of digital platforms that mediate daily life for billions. China had advanced from technological isolation to become a formidable innovator with unique strengths in manufacturing, mobile applications, and digital payments. The garage startups that once seemed so implausible to Chinese observers had grown into the world's most valuable companies. The founding myths of Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook had become modern business legends studied in business schools worldwide, including throughout China, and the casual innovation-focused culture that characterized Silicon Valley had influenced workplace practices globally. For Chinese engineers who witnessed this transformation, the journey evoked both admiration and determination. As one senior Chinese technologist who had first visited Silicon Valley in 1979 reflected in 2021, "When I first saw what they were doing with microprocessors, I couldn't believe it was real. Today, we're competing with them in cutting-edge fields like artificial intelligence. The gap hasn't closed completely, but the relationship has fundamentally changed from teacher and student to rivals who respect each other's strengths. This rivalry promises to define technological development for decades to come." Both Silicon Valley and China's technology hubs continue to evolve, with new companies emerging to challenge established giants. The semiconductor industry that launched Silicon Valley remains critically important, with chip shortages during the pandemic highlighting the strategic significance of this foundational technology. What began as American garage inventors shocking Chinese engineers has developed into a complex technological ecosystem spanning the Pacific. The innovations that emerged from Silicon Valley transformed not just computing, but virtually every aspect of modern life, creating economic value measured in trillions of dollars and reshaping social interactions for billions of people. The story of this transformation offers important lessons about innovation, economic development, and technological diffusion. Silicon Valley succeeded not just because of individual genius, but because it created an ecosystem that nurtured creativity, tolerated failure, and rewarded risk-taking. China's subsequent rise demonstrated that different cultural and political systems could adapt these principles while following distinct development paths. As we look toward the future of this technological relationship, one thing remains certain: the capacity for human ingenuity to create tools that extend our capabilities continues to accelerate. From vacuum tubes to quantum computers, from room-sized calculators to smartphones more powerful than the machines that guided Apollo to the moon, the story of computing's evolution reveals our extraordinary ability to transform abstract ideas into world-changing technologies. The garage inventors who shocked Chinese engineers didn't just create companies, they launched a technological revolution that continues to unfold. Their legacy lives on in the devices we carry, the networks that connect us, and the ongoing pursuit of innovations that once seemed impossible. In both Silicon Valley and China's technology hubs, that pursuit continues, driven by the same fundamental belief that technology can solve humanity's most pressing problems and open new frontiers of human potential.